the last hour of our brain food day. So Pascal and I will be speaking for the next 50 minutes or so on two different perspectives or angles on disseminating your research. I'll be talking about disseminating it orally through presentations, and Pascal will be discussing author rights and publishing. So I'll be sort of looking at presentations for the first half, and then we'll move it over to Pascal. And then after we have finished this, we want to keep you here until not until 4 o'clock, until 3:30, because for the last 10 minutes, we would like you to complete an evaluation of today. This is actually the first time that we've done brain food in an intensive one day. In the past, we've always had it at lunch hours throughout multiple weeks. So we're really interested in your feedback, as well as your feedback on just the content of the sessions today, and your ideas and thoughts about what you'd suggest as we move this further along. Okay, so disseminating your research. Okay. Before we actually talk about what to say about your research, we wanted to mention a few resources here in the library for you that are not part of the Brain Food series, which is very much walking you through sort of the beginning steps and into writing. But we wanted to talk a little bit about data, because that's something that we have not addressed at all. So a lot of you are in the midst of collecting data, or are planning to do so. And so there are some resources that you may or may not be familiar with here. So the first resource is the Data Resource Center. Who's heard of the Data Resource? Okay, great. Okay, so just another reminder that that's there. And then Pascal, did you want to talk about data management support? Or is that there?
Yeah, that's similar to that's what I was saying at the end of my little spiel there, where the DRC and the various services to help you sort of get through the data, find it, and manage it. And so those are all available through the DRC.
Okay. All right. Okay, moving on. Presentation components. So what I'm speaking about now for the next little bit are just a few things to keep in mind when you're presenting your research and your ideas to other people. I do want to specify that I am not referring at all to your comprehensive exams. A lot of people are very keen to know more about them and want preparation for them. I'm deliberately not addressing them here, because those exams that you have with members of the faculty in your department are very, very specific to your department. And so whatever could possibly be said in a group setting might not actually apply. So if you will be having some oral exams as part of your graduate work, I would just say, please talk to other graduate students in your department, talk to your advisor, because those can be very department specific. And certainly if you have questions, I would say that's the first place to go here. So as I'm talking about presentations here, I'm talking about ones which are a little less specific to the oral exam format, and I'm talking very much about when you're at a conference and you're presenting information, or let's say you are in a course and you are presenting 15 minutes on your graduate work. Let's say you are simply just talking to somebody about your work. What are some things that you need to keep in mind when you are presenting? So just going to start off with a little bit of brainstorming here. As you think about presentations, either ones that you have done yourself or presentations that you have been in terms of being in the audience and watching somebody give a presentation, and specifically academic presentations, what are some of the components of it that really help to make a presentation work? What makes a good presentation? Just throw out some ideas.
The tone of voice.
Okay. So what do you mean by tone of voice?
Don't be so monotonous.
Okay, all right. So not to be monotonous. So you need to...
And keep in a good level, loud, not too loud, but at the same time that's clear for everybody to listen.
Okay, so really paying attention to voice. making sure everybody can hear you, not making it so monotone that everything sounds exactly the same. Other things.
And also the speed of what you're saying, because
Mhm.
sometimes you can have a lot of things to say, but you need to breathe during presentation.
Yes. So pace, intonation. You might have been at a conference where you heard somebody rushing through their conference presentation so fast that it sounded as if they never actually took the time to breathe because they were trying to pack it all into their 15 minutes or so. I saw several hands here, so first you and then you.
Yes. It has to be appropriate for your audience, so whether it be terminology or theories that you use, if you provide enough background information.
Okay, and that can be tricky to do sometimes. You often have to make guesses about your audience. Sometimes the guesses are correct, and every now and then they are a little off. But yes, it has to be specific to that group. Yes?
Well, I was just going to add just that you're moving around and you stay active, making eye contact so that you appear engaged with your audience.
Okay, great. So there are lots of ways to show that you're engaged. Eye contact is one of those. Yes?
They're complementing your visuals.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just about everyone uses PowerPoint these days or has some type of visual, so you want your visual to add to your presentation. Other things? Mm-hmm.
I think audience involvement kind of keeps the audience awake and on their toes.
Okay. However, I will say that while I think audience involvement is a good thing, it sometimes can be specific to the situation. If you're at a conference where it's not expected that you say, well, turn to the person next to you and talk, everybody's like, oh, I don't want to do that. I'm here to listen to you and to hear about your research. So audience involvement can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes it's external, sometimes it's merely internal. You are assuming that your audience is involved merely by their decision to come to your presentation. Yes?
And your presentation will not have too much info.
Mhm.
It seems like it should be bullet points.
Okay. So specifically about the visuals, it needs to be concise. Yes?
I think dress for the occasion.
Okay. So how does one dress for the occasion?
Well, for me, if I'm presenting from my peers, I should be wearing the engineering ring. It's a must thing to do.
Okay.
But if I'm presenting for a school or something, nobody cares about it.
Okay. All right. So I'm actually going to put this under appropriate to audience, not just in what you say, not just in the terminology that you use, but thinking about what are the expectations of your audience for what you will do and how you will look. Great. Other things? Yes?
Have confidence in what you're saying?
Yes. Absolutely. Confidence. I think that's often tied in with engagement. If you don't feel confident, typically it's very hard to feel like you've got some engagement and rapport with the audience. Yes?
I was going to say sort out all kinds of technical problems, so issues with your laptop or with the PowerPoint itself, because it's embarrassing for you and almost everyone else in the room if you're struggling.
Okay. Yep. So we could say confidence, and also confidence with the technology that you have. Having said that, though, I think everybody is somewhat understanding that sometimes things break or don't work out. So you can also think about your audience. They're not out to get you. While, yes, they'd like to see your slides, they also can be understanding if something's happening and they're not quite working. But again, if you're not prepared, then it's hard to get going. And I was at a conference about a year ago, and it was my session. It was supposed to have started, but everybody was late moving from one thing to the next, and they couldn't get my laptop to work. So there were about 5 people standing behind me trying to do all these things with my laptop. And I was like, I've got to get going because I only have 55 minutes now, and I was supposed to have 60, and there's really a lot I wanted to do. So I was talking with just my notes without the wonderful, or at least I thought, the wonderful visuals that I had created to explain my theory that was going to solve all world problems. and 5 people behind me. So it was a bit nerve-wracking, and we've all had situations like that. Luckily, I was really enthusiastic about what I was talking about, and I think that helped in that situation. But it can be very nerve-wracking. Content, of course, isn't on here, and that's an important thing too. You have to have something that you want to say. Okay. Yes, but we're not talking about content. So briefly, I'm going to touch on just a few key things today. But what I would like you to do is just a little bit of reflection right now for 1 minute, and take a moment to write down what do you think are your strengths as a presenter, and what are a couple things that you'd like to improve. I find that just about everybody says that they feel they could be a better presenter. So it's okay to write down a few things, or just keep them in your mind. Okay, but why don't you take 1 minute right now to just think and write down. Okay, so you've had a couple of minutes to think about that. I'm now going to move to talking about 4 things specifically. And I'll just say right now that during the fall and winter, we do hour-and-a-half long workshops and sessions on presentation skills. So I'm taking what we would have done in an hour-and-a-half, taking out a lot of the practice actually doing presentations in front of people, and taking out about half the things I would normally want to discuss to whittle it down to some key things to think about. But these are some things that I think are important to be thinking about no matter where you are in your thesis process, when you're thinking about how are you going to share your information with other people. So the first thing that I wanted to mention was organization, which actually, strangely enough, didn't come up on this list, and it often does. And if you think about it, Jody was just saying, be very explicit in your writing when you're writing your thesis. It's really nice and clear if you say, I have 3 points that I want to make. Number 1, number 2, number 3. The same thing goes for presentations. I find, though, that a lot of people find presentations in a way to be a bit more challenging, because you have to really pay attention to your audience. When you're writing something, you're writing it with the understanding that if somebody gets a little bit lost or confused, they can always go back and reread what you had said. But if you are speaking, you can't rewind, and I don't really know if you're paying attention to me or if your brain is elsewhere, but one of my jobs is to make it easy for you to come back and focus. So if your brain flits elsewhere, eventually it comes back, and I want to make it easy for you as a participant to figure out where I am and what I'm saying. Okay. So if you think about what you do when you write and how you develop organization that way, it's often very much the same thing when you're working on a presentation. And I'm sure many of you do this automatically. So I'm just saying, be a little bit more aware of it as you're thinking about presenting, especially as you get very involved in your thesis work and it becomes very, very complex, and there are so many things that you want to say and so many tangents you can take to really whittle it down and say, okay, how can I organize this? So just as you have thesis statements in your writing, you almost pretty much have thesis statements in your presentations. This is the topic that I'm looking at. This is the question that I'm posing, if you go back to the idea of the research question. You have markers in what you're saying. Even more so, I'd say, that in presentation skills than in writing, to say first, second, third. So I already told you that there were 4 things I wanted to address. Number 1 is organization. So if you weren't paying much attention to me when I said there are 4 things, at least you know I'm on number 1 now, and then I'm going to get to a slide that says number 2. So it's giving you a tiny bit of a marker to know where I'm going with this. Another thing to think about too is that going back to sort of audience expectations. If you haven't yet gone to a lot of conferences in your field, but you're planning to go, it's really nice to sit in and see what are the cultural norms and expectations in that group before you actually give a presentation. If you're giving a presentation the first time you're going to a conference, talk to somebody who's been to that conference before to figure out more about what's expected. So is it expected that you stand and talk for 15 minutes and then you sit down? Are questions invited while you're talking or only after? I go to a lot of educational conferences where in every single session, the audience expects you to turn around, talk to your partner, and do some activities together. And they get disappointed if you don't do that. So whereas others get really annoyed if you say, why take time out to talk to my partner? I just want to hear about your research. So you need to figure these things out before. You also need to figure out if there's a particular organizational pattern to presentations that's expected. So really obvious example is, do you invite questions during the presentation or only after the presentation? I've talked sometimes to students who really want to do something different. They say, oh, every presentation is exactly the same. I'm going to do something really creative with mine. And I'd say that can be fine if you have a lot of confidence in what you're doing. But even then, you might want to prepare your audience that because all you have is that little time frame, you might even want to start off your presentation by saying, just to let you know, I'm going to do something a bit different. So your audience can make that mental adjustment. Okay, I'm going to expect something different in this. And then when you actually get to the more creative or different thing that you're doing, they know, and then they can make that mental switch. Because everybody gets used to a certain style, and it can become a bit abrupt if you don't warn people about that. Okay. I also wanted to talk about visuals, because that's another one that comes up. I'd like you to refer you to a document which I found very helpful. I personally love bullets when I make PowerPoint slides, and it's been one of my goals over several years to reduce the number of bullets that I have and do other things with my PowerPoint slides. But I find this quite a struggle, and it's something that I need to constantly be thinking about. So I found this really useful. It's called 5 Ways to Reduce PowerPoint Overload. It's very short. It's a quick and easy read. And it really is 5 ways to really think about how you use PowerPoint effectively. You can find it online. And I just noted at the bottom, the best way to find it is just to use Google. The last names, Atkinson and Meyer, and PowerPoint. And you'll find it. It'll come up quite quickly. To me, one of the underlying principles that I've really appreciated is that they say when you're creating a presentation, often what at least I tend to do is they say, oh, okay, presentation coming up. Let me open up my PowerPoint slides right away and let me think about my title, and then let me think about what I want on my first slide and then what I want on my second slide. That's not necessarily the most effective way to do it. So instead, sit down, take out a piece of paper, not your PowerPoint, and write what you want to say, or at least an outline of what you want to do. And then think about the PowerPoint as a way to complement what you want to say. That you really want your audience to focus on you and not all the text on the screen. And so to do so, you're just using that PowerPoint to accentuate certain ideas. So that was, for me, one very helpful thing. Okay. Also, in relation to visuals, are using charts, diagrams, and tables. So what's wrong with this chart? Why is this a bad example of a chart for a presentation?
It doesn't say anything about what it means.
Okay, there's no meaning there.
Yeah.
It's a chart. If you use PowerPoint and you use the add a chart, the smart chart feature, you'll end up with something like this. Well, it doesn't say very much. And one of the recommendations is actually not to use the smart charts in PowerPoint if you are going to do some visuals, that if you are using charts and data for your research, you have much more powerful programs that you can use to create really good charts, and instead import those into there. Also emphasize for your audience what it is you want them to pay attention to. So at the very least, I should edit out the bars that don't matter. and I need to have some arrows or other information directing the reader or directing the audience to certain places. Because again, if you're writing, you have that text to direct your reader, and you know your reader can spend more time thinking about it. Here, your audience might see your table or your chart for just a minute. You also want to keep in mind, oh, what if their attention drifts? Even if they're not listening to what I'm saying, can they make sense of what I have there? There's no way to make sense of this or know why it's important without some additional visual information. Okay. So number 3 is rapport. There are actually quite a lot of things that you had here that were related to rapport with the audience. And I would say, I personally feel that all of these types of issues can be really important. This gets in also, as I said, into confidence. That if you feel really nervous about your presentation, chances are you're going to be looking at your notes and not making that eye contact with your audience. Okay. If you do get nervous about presentations, I'm actually not even going to ask you to raise your hand if you get nervous, because I'm going to assume that 75% of you would raise your hand and say, yes, I do. There are definitely some strategies that you can use. So again, this is a really short session. We don't go into them here very much, but I am going to point you to a few resources that you can think about if you want more information. One key thing is to start strong. Just as in your writing, you want to start strong, be clear, jump into what you're saying. You want to do the same with your presentation. You also want to end on a strong note. And that is something to pay attention to in your own presentations. You can always find somebody, you could, videotape yourself. And what I have found is a lot of people start strong, and they're so relieved to be done at the end, and then they just kind of wander off like, okay, done, bye. And you've just then lost all of that momentum. So pay attention to your starting and ending points as a really key thing for maintaining that rapport and that strength to your audience. If you get really nervous and don't want to make eye contact, I've also heard a little trick. You stare at people's foreheads. It looks like you're making eye contact, but you're really not making eye contact. It sounds really silly, but it works. And there are also lots of other sort of little tricks. Like you can plant a friend in the audience who, no matter what, will smile and nod at you and make you feel really good. And that's really important, especially if you're in a new situation, say at a conference that's quite large. You want to make sure you have a friendly face or two there.
So the types of open access, and this is what I was referring to before, we tend to call them gold and green. You don't necessarily need to know that. That's not relevant, but it is important to know that there is two kind of types that you need to think about when you go to publish. The first type, so gold, publishing strictly in open access journals, and I just talked about what some of the advantages and disadvantages are of that. But then the other type of open access is publishing in any journal, so it could be a traditional journal, for-profit journal, but making the articles available via some kind of an open access platform. So that could be the institutional repository, the atrium, which is often called self-archiving. And this obviously requires negotiation with the publisher, unless the publisher has a flexible contract, and more of the traditional publishers do, because they know that people have to, right? They're aware, obviously, that funding agencies are requiring people to publish open access, so they're becoming more flexible. But I still see a lot of publishers that are not, and particularly in veterinary sciences, animal sciences. For some reason, a lot of those journals are pretty slow to adapt and tend to have pretty restrictive publishing contracts that try to take authors' rights away from them. But certainly this is possible, and this is what you need to sort of think about. So if you're going to be publishing parts of your thesis, if you publish in a strictly open access journal, you probably won't have a problem. If you publish your chapter of your thesis in a non-open access journal, you really need to pay attention to what the contract says, and you need to negotiate your rights if the contract says that you can't you can't publish, you can't post your work in an institutional repository. That's where students run into problems when they have to submit their thesis to the atrium. So I'll just go over briefly different types of rights, so you're aware of what your rights are as an author. And in the Canadian legal context, there are two types of rights. So economic rights, which is copyright, and they're called economic rights because copyright developed to make sure that people got profit out of whatever work they produced. In academic publishing, there's no, well, there is profit, but not for you. You're not going to see any money. It goes to the journal publishers, but they're still called economic rights because the premise is if you publish a book or something, you know, you have the right to get whatever revenue is generated from that. And then moral rights, which I'll talk about in a moment. So what is copyright in Canada? First of all, the author owns copyright as soon as she writes something down in any format. So as soon as something is typed into a word processor or written down on paper, the author automatically has copyright. It doesn't have to be registered, although you can register it with Copyright Canada. That can be done online through a government website. But it doesn't affect it doesn't give you any more copyright than you would have if you didn't register it. It's sometimes suggested that one registers copyright if, for example, you think there's going to be any profit coming out of whatever it is you write. You want to make sure that you can, it just makes it easier to prove that you have copyright if somebody ever tries to challenge it. So if you think you're not going to make any money out of academic work, but if you think you ever write something that would, you might want to register it. Or if you think that for some reason somebody may ever want to challenge your copyright, very rarely happens with students' thesis work. I mean, but it is a possibility. So having copyright allows you to do whatever you want with your work. It allows you to disseminate it, post it on your website, do whatever, use it in teaching. And the other side of the coin is that if you sign away copyright, you may lose the right to do some of these things with your own work. Now, students always own their copyright when they write something as students. So I do get a lot of questions about from students who kind of wonder if the university has some or partial copyright over the thesis, or if their advisor can make some decisions about publishing. And no, students have full copyright. And I say as students because there would be a difference if you're writing something as part of a research team or you're hired and paid to do that. Then the copyright law says if you're writing something as an employee, the institution would have copyright. But if it's your thesis, you have copyright. And also if you're writing something jointly with a faculty member, but you're not working for them, just writing something that you've both researched, which often happens, especially with PhD students or postdocs, you have joint copyright. So copyright law doesn't recognize hierarchies, and the advisor can't necessarily go and do whatever he or she wants without asking permission. And that actually does happen a lot, where an advisor thinks that he's the advisor, so even though he's written it jointly with a student, he can do something with he can publish without asking the student for permission. And legally he can't, although it creates, most people don't want to sue their advisors for copyright. So, what does one do? I mean, that's up to the person to decide at that point what they want to do. Although if an advisor were to do that, to sign away copyright, and the student hadn't given their permission, then he or she could act as though he or she didn't give up permission, so could continue to treat the work as though it was not, the copyright hadn't been signed away, because it would be the advisor's responsibility for having done that, signed away the copyright without asking for permission. And if the journal wanted to sue somebody for copyright violation, they'd have to sue the advisor. So that's a way of dealing it without having to sue him or her yourself. That doesn't happen too often, but it does happen. It does crop up once in a while, and we have to deal with it. The work remains in copyright until 50 years after your death. Again, that's sort of an economic thing if your work is going to make a lot of money. And an author may sign away, of course, copyright. As I suggested before, it used to be very common when there were only traditional journals, no open access. The journals knew that people had no choice. They had to publish, so they used to take advantage of that to get people to sign away their copyright. Now people have more options. So that's copyright economic rights. As I said, there are two sets of rights. The other set of rights are called moral rights, and that is the right of attribution. Now, these stay in place even if you sign away copyright. So they're two separate sets of rights. So you can sign away your copyright, which people are often asked to do to some extent, but you still retain your moral rights. So the right of attribution means even if you sign away your copyright, whenever or wherever your work is published, it still has to be attributed to you. So your name has to be on the work. And the right to the integrity of the work. So again, also separate from copyright. And this would prevent the publisher, even if they have copyright, from breaking up the work, repackaging it in a way that says something different from what you originally wanted to say, using your work in association with some kind of a product or something that you objected to, or anything that would damage the integrity of the work. You could stop that from happening, even if you'd signed away copyright, by invoking your moral rights. Now, they can't be signed over like copyright can, but they can be waived. But there's no justification. It's fairly rare that journals will ask you to waive your moral rights, although I actually have seen it a few times. And I mean, people, because one of the things that I do is consultations, and I look at people's contracts as well and point out some red flags. Sometimes people don't know what it means. If you're being asked to waive your moral rights, that's a very bad thing. Don't do that. Because you can't get it back, and obviously these things, they can take your name out, and there's no justification for it for any journal to ask you to do that. So do look for that and don't do it. So what to negotiate? So when you get a publishing contract, they can often be many pages long, a lot of legal type language. They're not very fun to read. But what are some of the things that you want to look at? So if it asks you to sign away copyright, there are still something you can ask sometimes the contract will actually say, yes, you're signing away copyright, but here are some of the rights you can retain. Sometimes it won't, and if it doesn't, you can negotiate those. So to reproduce the article in any format for non-commercial purposes, that's something you can ask for. To perform the article for non-commercial purposes. This would actually be reading large parts of your article. So if you've signed away copyright and you go somewhere and read it in a public forum, you could actually be violating the publisher's copyright for your own work just by performing it. So you may want to retain that right. To convert the article by preparing derivative works. It could be translations or other types of derivative works. To post and I'll get into what preprint and postprint mean in a minute, but to post a preprint or a postprint in an institutional repository, that one is particularly important for you as students if you're going to be publishing chapters of your thesis before you submit the thesis, and then to communicate or disseminate the article. So preprint, this is the kind of language you'll often see in a publishing contract. The preprint is just the version you submit to a journal before it goes through the peer review process. The postprint is the final draft after it's been through the peer review process and after you've integrated the recommendations. And then sometimes you'll also see the publisher's version, PDF version, which is the postprint that's actually been formatted and made to look pretty, so the actual thing, the exact copy that goes into the journal. And you'll often see in publishing contracts that are more flexible and that do allow you to keep certain rights, they'll often make a distinction between these. So they'll say you can post a preprint to an institutional repository but not a postprint, or you can do a preprint and a postprint but not the PDF version. So that's the kind of thing you want to look out for, and you want to make sure that you can, at the very least, use a preprint, do what you want with a preprint, because that would at least satisfy the thesis graduation requirement. Make sure you can have your preprint as a thesis chapter. Most people like to integrate the suggestions from the peer review process into their chapter when they put it into their thesis. So ideally, you would also be able to post a postprint to an institutional repository. Does that make sense? Does anybody have any questions about any of that? I'm just going to show you a couple of resources. So there's a site that's very useful for determining this kind of thing called Sherpa Romeo. And you can just Google Sherpa Romeo and you'll find the site. But what you can do with that is put in the name of a particular journal. So if you've identified a journal, as we talked about in the beginning, you kind of know you want to publish there, but you know you have the, you have to retain certain rights. It will give you a sense of what their publishing policies are. So here's just an example of what you would find. So here's the journal Nature. So you see the journal Nature allows you to archive a preprint. So for that, again, if you just wanted to use the preprint in your thesis, that would be fine. It allows you also to post a postprint subject to certain restrictions, and those restrictions are, for example, you have to acknowledge the publisher, that the publisher has copyright and that kind of thing. So that this is actually pretty flexible. So this journal, Nature, which is one of the most prestigious journals in the world, has adapted and is pretty flexible. You can't do anything with the publisher's version, PDF version, but that's fine because it's fairly flexible with the postprint, so you'd be okay with this. Are there any questions?